Hi, I'm Robert Beiser, Executive Director of Seattle Against Slavery, and I'm going to be talking today about preventing commercial sexual exploitation before it starts. When we're talking about preventing commercial sexual exploitation, it's important to remember that responding once the violence has already happened isn't our only option. Just imagine if we thought that way about terrorism, that we could only react once attacks had already occurred, instead of trying to prevent them before they start. The Center for Disease Control uses a public health approach to think about the ways that we can prevent violence like commercial sexual exploitation. There's primary prevention, where we look upstream at the broad culture where violence might happen and what are the forces that we can address that'll make violence less likely. There's secondary prevention, looking at the people who are the most likely to be involved in the violence, in this case, sex buyers or potential pimps or traffickers and the people around them. And then there's tertiary prevention. We look at the people who have actually caused violence already and try to make sure that they don't commit that violence again. These are the folks that create the highest opportunity for us to prevent violence because we know that they're already willing to commit it. Working against trafficking and commercial sexual exploitation is a fairly new field, but we can learn lessons on how to be effective from other work on forms of gender-based violence that aren't human trafficking. There was a time when work against domestic violence was solely focused on creating shelters and giving victims a place to go once they had experienced violence already. Now, we teach young men and boys ways to channel anger that don't lead to violence, and when violence occurs, the community intervenes to hold abusers accountable. A study of relationship violence prevention programs with teens called Safe Dates showed that classes and programs focused on not committing acts of violence can actually reduce the rates of violence occurring in youth communities by over 30%. That's an incredible impact. When we first start thinking about trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation, the focus is almost always on victims and survivors. Many times, the response to prostitution and trafficking has been so focused on the victims that the victims themselves are arrested at staggering rates, even when they are a minor who is known not to be able to consent. But when we look at preventing commercial sexual exploitation, it's important to remember there's always at least one other person involved every time that a victim is exploited. When someone talks about a trafficking victim being exploited for years, that means that hundreds or even thousands of men were paying to have sex with that victim against their consent. That would be rape under any other circumstances. And those buyers put thousands or even millions of dollars into the hands of pimps and traffickers, giving them a constant incentive for violent exploitation. It's important to remember also that these buyers may be very different people from the folks that are normally arrested for prostitution or pimping and trafficking. In a recent 3-year sample of men in King County convicted of buying sex from minors, most were professionals in their 40s and 50s, well-educated, and were middle or upper middle class income. By comparison, when you look at the youth who are exploited for commercial sex in King County, the majority, even in a 67% white county, are youth of color. Many of them have been homeless, and they've experienced prior sexual assault or abuse. So why is it important to take a prevention approach? Well, let's look at the issue of shark poaching in countries in East Asia. In countries across the Pacific Rim, governments are spending millions of dollars to stop the illegal poaching of sharks that is leading to several species going extinct. But they're not trying to address this problem because they have sharks or because sharks are particularly vulnerable in that area. In Washington State, we have sharks too, and any fisherman will tell you that's not a catch that you want to have. They don't want to put a shark up on their wall, shark meat isn't particularly valuable, and it can be kind of dangerous to reel in a shark. So we don't have a shark poaching problem here. In Asia, by comparison, shark meat, shark fins, and even shark bones are incredibly valuable. As a result, you see that there's a massive issue with people finding sharks to support the demand for those shark components. Without the demand, there'd be no shark poaching problem. The demand for commercial sex isn't inherently about men's need to buy sex, just like the demand for sharks isn't about any inherent need for human beings to eat sharks. Commercial sex is about a culture that says it's normal to buy sex. Many countries have more vulnerable populations by poverty or oppression, but have lower rates of commercial sex. And there are countries that have less vulnerable populations with lower rates of poverty, but sex buying there is much more common. It's an issue of cultural norms, not of vulnerable populations. Changing the culture around an issue like commercial sex isn't that radical an idea, especially when you look at what we've done around issues of sexual harassment and assault. It used to be common practice when we were talking about sexual assault to give a whistle to a woman who might be at risk of being raped or assaulted and saying, "We hope that when you're attacked, you blow this whistle and something good will happen." Now we think that that's a ridiculous idea, and instead, every business has a sexual harassment policy. Every college and workplace has a way to explain that sexually assaulting someone in that environment is a thing that that community is going to strive against. The model that the Center for Disease Control uses to address violence is just like the one they use to address other health problems. Start with the individual and work your way outward. That individual, who might be the person causing violence, has peers, and so you can address the issue of commercial sex with the peers of the person who might be a buyer or trafficker. Those peers are part of a community, and so you can address the issue at a community level. That community is full of institutions. Think schools, businesses, governments, and you can address this issue at the institutional level. And then that institution is part of a whole system. And the system is where you think of things like laws or broad-scale cultural practices. Law enforcement is a great example of how we can address this. When we think about commercial sexual exploitation, you can choose if you're going to arrest the person in prostitution, the person involved in trafficking, or the buyer, and you have a limited set of resources. When you're choosing to address this in an upstream way, that buyer becomes a very important piece in addressing commercial sexual exploitation long-term in a sustainable way. Law enforcement has seen how you can have success in areas of prevention with campaigns like reducing driving under the influence. While the laws about DUI haven't changed much, the emphasis of law enforcement has significantly shifted towards more campaigns about the arrests that they make when people are driving under the influence. The phrase "drive sober or get pulled over" has become commonplace, and everyone understands that if you're driving under the influence, you run the risk of a significant criminal penalty and fine. The result? There's been a massive decrease in the number of deaths related to drunk driving, and that was ultimately the focus of anti-drunk driving efforts in the first place. Just to review, primary prevention can work to set norms early with peers of people who might be involved in commercial sex. That means developing empathy, compassion, and setting a norm that we don't want the harm that is caused by sex buying in our community. Secondary prevention can focus on the people we think are likely to be connected to that violence. With commercial sexual exploitation, that likely means men who could be buyers of sex or folks who are involved in trafficking, and we can determine that based on their social behavior, things that they're doing online, or even their workplaces or peer groups. Thirdly, we need a comprehensive plan for what the community is going to do when men are caught buying sex. This is tertiary prevention. That means holding those buyers accountable and having programs that'll reduce the likelihood that they're going to exploit people again in the future. This won't be a quick process to change the norms around commercial sexual exploitation, but it can be a lasting one, and it can have a profound impact on keeping people in our community safe from really horrible types of violence. Over the past 20 years, we've seen huge changes in attitudes about race, gender, sexual assault, even marriage equality, and changes in the attitudes around commercial sexual exploitation can go right along with it. Technology is also speeding up the pace of change, and we can use that as a tool to help reduce commercial sexual exploitation, bringing safety to people as quickly as possible. For more information about preventing commercial sexual exploitation, you can visit seattleagainstslavery.org or stopbuying.me. Ultimately, the goal for all of us should be preventing the harm that's caused to real individuals by commercial sexual exploitation. And that's why preventing CSE is so important, because we want to stop that harm before it starts. Thank you.